Hi folks, with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the comedy shows, sort of the late show and late night show, and all the comedy shows that today people like Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert and so on, and compare what you see today on these supposed comedy shows or late night talk shows, which are supposed to include a lot of comedy. And say Dave Letterman and Johnny Carson, the earlier days of Jay Leno, that sort of thing, say 35 plus years ago. Now, I first came across US late night TV, the Late Show and everything, and I think it was Johnny Carson I first saw when I was a young guy, very first off when I was on business traveling and sitting in a hotel room, you sort of channel surfing, and you'd come across the show, and some of the jokes that they tell were quite funny. Given I wasn't as plugged into the American political scene as a local person might be, then I didn't quite see the humour for some of it. But as if I was there for long enough, and like reading the newspapers and watching the news and that sort of thing, this is pre-internet, of course. Then I'd say, okay, no, but I remember there's one joke about some guy, and I remember this, Dan Rotenkowski, I think his name was, and he was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and they were poking fun at him. Now, it wasn't sort of a propaganda messaging thing, or not that I detected at the time. Now, just to make sure that I wasn't sort of too gullible back then, I went back to some of the Dave Letterman shows and even the Johnny Carson stuff, Jay Leno too, and had a look at the jokes and had a listen to the jokes, and they were poking fun at it. Everybody was fair game. If you were in the news and it was a subject that sort of people heard about and knew about, that somehow had been a headline news, or maybe it was a very well-known person, they would have a go at anybody, and they would attack Democrats just as much as they would attack Republicans or anyone else for that matter. So there was not that I could tell, at least, there was no ideological sort of bent to it. Now, the other thing that I looked at was the number of writers. Now, there were a lot of joke writers and writers for these shows like Letterman and Carson and so on. And really, Letterman and say Jay Leno, those sort of people, they were just the guys who could deliver the jokes to camera. But a lot of the writers were there, and they had a lot of writers. I mean, Letterman must have had, pushing 50 writers. Now, I'm sure they weren't all working at the same time on the same show, but he had a large pool of writers, a lot of whom had some sort of background in comedy or so on. Now, I'd say in Letterman's case, maybe you'd rate 20% of the writers were activists. And you did see some activist jokes or activist points being made, but it just wasn't very often. It was rare, and those people, if you sort of look into the back, and I just got a random sort of few people I looked at, and they at the time would have been fairly tame in the act. They were activists, Jewish activism, for example, was one prominent one, but they were. In activism terms, pretty tame by today's standards. They weren't propaganda. They weren't pushing the mass migration. They weren't pushing climate change. None of those things were really issues on the table, and so their activism was again pretty sort of low level. For example, when Bill Clinton, Democrat President Bill Clinton, had that business with Monica Lewinsky and the cigar, that was exploited. Rather ruthlessly, I thought, for its humour value, and some of it actually was quite funny. But they would go after a Republican just as much as they would a Democrat, and so on. So I didn't see, and even today, don't really pick a political agenda other than a few little lower level mentions. If they did play a propaganda card, it was done quite tamely and could have gone in under the radar. Now today that's quite different, and the jokes were actually quite. Some of them, every one of them, the jokes were actually quite funny there, considering the number of Dave Letterman had. I think he had like a top 10 jokes or something like that segment. And not every one of them, but some of them were actually quite funny, and Letterman delivered them quite well. So because you got to get the timing right on the punchline and some of these to for the humor to have full effect, and Letterman was quite good on his timing. So anyway, that was then. Now look at now, and I can sit through all the jokes of Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel. I don't laugh at anything. Yes, there's nothing that's funny. I don't even smile and nothing. It's just all fucking propaganda. And yet the crowd, the audience seems to go, so Trump is a Nazi, raucous applause, yeah. Oh yeah, and white people are evil Nazis, yeah. And somebody queried mass migration here, and they're obviously Hitler, yeah, rah, clap. So everything is a political joke, and it's everything is anti-white people, anti-Trump, anti-Republican, pro-migration, mass migration, pro. So it's clearly, really heavily on one side of the ideological spectrum and vehemently opposing the other side, and trying to encourage people to jeer and sneer at anyone that's not in in that globalist ideological sort of camp. But I can't find humour. Again, try as I might, listening to Colbert and Kimmel and those who I just can't laugh at it because nothing seems funny. It's so obviously a political ideological delivery designed to encourage a particular mode of thought rather than humour. Now, again, you go and look at the writers that support it, and you're looking at hardcore activists. They're not employing comedy writers. Far from it. They're employing hardcore activists. Radical lesbians, radical globalists, radical pro-migration, and so on. So there's the type of writer, understandably, by the way, is very different. But I invite you, go and have a look at a Jay Leno from, say, 1990, for example, or a Letterman show from 1980, 87, or a Johnny Carson show from the pre-Letterman days. Have a look and just look at some of the joke segments, and you may not think every one of them is raucously funny, but you'll be hard pushed to find any continual sort of one-sided thread of ideology through it. At least I couldn't, and I don't remember it from when I used to look at it. They didn't have a sort of an equivalent late show type format in Australia at the time, so it was sort of something a little bit different. I remember when I first went to the US, but I became more sort of au fait with the American political and what was headlining in newspapers scene. I could appreciate more of the humour. Some of it I thought was quite clever, but again, I didn't pick that idea. But today, that whole sort of area, Trevor Noah and all those people, it's all given over to propaganda delivery. Now, this is consistent with the globalist project. There's very little now that isn't propaganda delivery in any format. You look at the advertising on television in Australia, or any sort of advertising online, and you'd swear that 80% of the population was black. You'd swear that there was every male-female relationship was mixed race because of what's depicted in the advertising. You'd swear that every black person you meet is super urbane, super well-dressed, super fit, has a very important, well-paying job, and is taking those wayward, silly white people in hand and giving them good life advice that they otherwise, and so on. So you'd swear that was how or you would swear on the other side that there are just so many Nazis in white supremacist Nazis in Australia. There's possibly no one who isn't a white supremacist Nazi amongst white people. So this ridiculous propaganda is all over the place, and it's something that didn't exist years ago. And I invite you to have a look at TV shows or have a look at newspapers, where you can look at them online from 30, 40, 50 years ago, and you won't see any of this stuff. So clearly there's a coordinated propaganda message that's being forced on us without our consent bit like mass migration and climate change stuff. It's being forced on us without our consent, without our agreement, without a vote. And this is apparent, and a manifestation of that, a very clear one as well, is the propaganda that we see going through the shows like the Colberts and the Kimmels and so on. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.